Imagine walking into the most magnificent palace in Europe, expecting to witness the pinnacle of human civilization, only to be assaulted by a stench so overwhelming that courtiers carry perfumed handkerchiefs just to breathe. You're standing in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles in 1685, surrounded by nobles draped in silk and velvet, worth more than entire villages. Yet the air is thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, rotting teeth, and human waste. The woman beside you, a duchess whose jewelry could fund an army, hasn't bathed in 3 months and considers this a mark of spiritual purity. The gentleman to your left, a duke who commands thousands of soldiers, believes that washing his body will invite disease and corruption into his soul. Welcome to the court of Louis XIV, where cleanliness wasn't just discouraged, it was considered a dangerous sin against God himself. Before we dive into this forgotten world of aristocratic filth and divine dirt, if you enjoy discovering the shocking truths hidden beneath history's glamorous surface, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content that reveals what really happened behind palace doors. And please, comment below to let me know where you're watching from. I find it fascinating that we're exploring these bizarre historical realities together from all corners of the world, connected by our shared amazement at how differently our ancestors lived. What you're about to discover isn't just another tale of historical oddity. This is the story of how religious fanaticism, medical ignorance, and royal vanity combined to create a court where the most powerful people in Europe lived in conditions that would horrify modern homeless shelters. The Palace of Versailles, symbol of absolute monarchy and architectural perfection, was simultaneously the most beautiful and most disgusting place on earth. To understand how Europe's elite became walking advertisements for poor hygiene, we need to start with the man who made it all possible. Louis XIV wasn't born dirty. In fact, his early childhood followed relatively normal bathing practices for French royalty. But as he grew into his role as the Sun King, something fundamental shifted in his relationship with cleanliness, and his twisted logic would contaminate an entire civilization. The seeds of this madness were planted in Louis's adolescence, when his personal confessor, a fanatical Jesuit named Father Anat, began filling the young king's head with ideas about bodily purity that would have shocked even medieval monks. Father Anat preached that the human body was inherently sinful, a vessel of corruption that needed to be mortified rather than pampered. According to his twisted theology, washing the body was an act of vanity that demonstrated dangerous self-love and distracted the soul from contemplating divine matters. But Father Anat's influence went deeper than simple religious instruction. He convinced the teenage Louis that his royal body was sacred, not in a way that demanded care and cleanliness, but in a way that made it too holy to be subjected to the base practice of washing. The king's flesh, Anat argued, was blessed by God and anointed with divine authority. To scrub it with soap and water was to suggest that God's work needed improvement, a blasphemous notion that could endanger the king's immortal soul. This wasn't just religious extremism, it was religious extremism with political implications. Father Anat understood that controlling the king's relationship with his own body was a form of psychological dominance that would extend to every aspect of royal decision-making. A king who believed his unwashed state was proof of divine favor was a king who would never question the religious authorities who reinforced that belief. Louis absorbed these lessons with the intensity that only adolescents can muster when adults give them permission to rebel against basic social expectations. Here was an authority figure telling him that his natural teenage resistance to bathing wasn't laziness or defiance, it was spiritual sophistication. The young king began to see his developing body odor not as something embarrassing, but as a badge of religious devotion that set him apart from lesser mortals who still clung to the primitive practice of washing themselves. By the time Louis reached his 20s and began asserting his absolute authority over France, his aversion to bathing had become inseparable from his sense of royal identity. Court observers noted that the king would go months without allowing water to touch his skin, treating his accumulated grime as a kind of holy relic that proved his special relationship with the divine. When courtiers occasionally suggested that His Majesty might benefit from a bath, Louis would respond with genuine outrage, as if they had proposed that he commit sacrilege. The king's personal hygiene routine, such as it was, became a carefully choreographed ritual that managed to avoid actual cleanliness while maintaining the appearance of royal grooming. Each morning, Louis would be attended by a small army of valets who would wipe his face and hands with dry cloths, apply layers of powder to absorb the worst of his body's emanations, and drench him in perfumes that created a sickly sweet cloud around his person. The powder, made from ground rice and occasionally mixed with lead for that fashionable pale complexion, would cake in the creases of his unwashed skin, creating a paste-like substance that trapped bacteria and made his hygiene problems exponentially worse. His hair, which grew long and unwashed for months at a time, became a breeding ground for lice that the royal wig makers would simply powder over rather than eliminate. The elaborate wigs that became synonymous with Louis's court weren't originally fashion statements. They were desperate attempts to hide the king's increasingly disgusting natural hair while creating the illusion of cleanliness and style. The irony was profound. The most visually stunning court in European history was built on a foundation of hidden filth. Louis's teeth, never properly cleaned, began rotting in his mouth by his 30s, creating a breath so foul that courtiers learned to position themselves upwind during audiences. The king's dental hygiene consisted entirely of occasionally rinsing with wine, not for cleanliness, but because he enjoyed the taste. His decaying teeth would eventually require multiple extractions performed without anesthesia, procedures that left him in agony for weeks and created infected wounds that added their own distinctive smell to his already overwhelming personal aroma. But the most disturbing aspect of Louis's hygiene wasn't his personal practices. It was how he transformed his individual dysfunction into a court-wide social system. The Sun King understood that his power depended on making the nobility dependent on his approval for everything, including their most basic life choices. If he could convince the aristocracy that cleanliness was not just unnecessary, but actually dangerous, he could create a shared culture of filth that would bind them together in mutual dependence and shame. The process began subtly, with Louis making casual comments about the spiritual dangers of excessive bathing during court gatherings. He would praise courtiers who appeared particularly unwashed, describing their aroma as evidence of their devotion to higher things than bodily vanity. When visiting dignitaries from cleaner courts appeared at Versailles, Louis would make pointed remarks about their obvious obsession with worldly appearance, suggesting that their cleanliness revealed a shallow character unsuited to the profound spiritual and intellectual atmosphere of the French court. Gradually, the message became clear. Washing was not just discouraged at Versailles. It was seen as a sign of moral weakness and social climbing. Courtiers who arrived too clean were viewed with suspicion, as if they were trying to put on airs or demonstrate superiority over their more authentically aristocratic peers. The logic was perverse but effective. True nobility was so secure in its status that it didn't need to resort to the common practice of bathing to make itself acceptable to others. The transformation of Versailles into a palace of calculated filth didn't happen overnight. It took years of careful social engineering, with Louis and his inner circle gradually escalating the expectations for aristocratic grubbiness, until what had once been considered basic human decency became a mark of bourgeois vulgarity. Courtiers found themselves trapped in an escalating competition of deliberate uncleanliness, each trying to prove their noble authenticity by surpassing their peers in creative forms of personal neglect. Women at court developed elaborate techniques for maintaining their appearance while avoiding actual cleanliness. They would spend hours arranging their unwashed hair into towering sculptures, held in place with pomades that attracted insects and created small ecosystems of decay within their coiffures. Their faces, painted with lead-based cosmetics that were never properly removed, developed layers of makeup that could crack and flake off in chunks during animated conversations. The contrast between their ornate clothing and their deteriorating skin created a surreal effect that visitors from other courts found both fascinating and horrifying. The men, not to be outdone in the art of aristocratic uncleanliness, developed their own traditions of calculated slovenliness. They would wear the same undergarments for weeks at a time, considering the accumulated stains and odours as proof of their busy social schedules and important responsibilities. Their elaborate court costumes, never cleaned and passed down through generations, became repositories of decades' worth of sweat, food stains, and bodily fluids that created unique aromatic signatures for each noble family. The social pressure to remain dirty became so intense that courtiers who were discovered bathing in private would face genuine social ostracism. Servants were instructed to report any evidence of unauthorized cleanliness to the king's inner circle, and nobles found with clean fingernails or fresh-smelling hair would be subjected to public humiliation disguised as gentle teasing. The court developed an entire vocabulary of euphemisms for describing different types and degrees of noble filth, with specific terms for the various stages of aristocratic decay that a proper courtier was expected to achieve. Louis himself became the ultimate arbiter of acceptable uncleanliness, conducting informal inspections of his courtiers to ensure they were maintaining appropriate standards of noble squalor. He would comment approvingly on particularly pungent individuals, describing their aroma as evidence of their authentic aristocratic nature. The king developed a connoisseur's appreciation for different types of body odor, claiming he could identify a person's noble lineage by their distinctive smell. This wasn't mere eccentricity, it was a deliberate system of social control that used shame and peer pressure to enforce conformity to the king's bizarre standards. The medical consequences of this court-wide commitment to filthiness were catastrophic, but they were rationalized through an elaborate system of pseudo-scientific theories that made disease and decay seem like natural consequences of noble living. Court physicians, desperate to maintain their positions, developed increasingly creative explanations for why their patients' health problems were actually signs of aristocratic superiority rather than evidence of poor hygiene. The royal physicians at Versailles became masters of medical doublespeak, transforming obvious symptoms of poor hygiene into badges of aristocratic honor. When courtiers developed skin rashes from their unwashed clothing, the doctors proclaimed these irritations as evidence of noble blood's natural sensitivity to common fabrics. The festering sores that appeared on unwashed bodies were described as the aristocratic constitution purging itself of base humours that plagued lesser mortals. Even the lice infestations that plagued the court were reframed as proof that noble blood was so rich and refined that it attracted these creatures like precious metals drew alchemists. Dr. Antoine Vallot, Louis's personal physician, became particularly skilled at this grotesque medical theatre. When the king developed painful boils from his unwashed undergarments, Vallot declared them sacred wounds that demonstrated God's special attention to his chosen monarch. The infected abscesses that regularly appeared on Louis's body were treated not with cleanliness, but with elaborate poultices made from exotic ingredients that were designed more to impress than to heal. Vallot would spend hours describing how the king's unique royal humours created these magnificent eruptions, making disease sound like a divine gift rather than a consequence of basic neglect. The court's medical establishment developed an entire mythology around the supposed health benefits of avoiding water. They claimed that bathing opened the pores to dangerous miasmas that could corrupt the noble spirit, that soap stripped away protective oils that God had specifically designed to shield aristocratic skin from common ailments. According to their theories, The accumulated grime on a courtier's body formed a natural armor against disease, with each layer of dirt representing another barrier between the noble person and the contaminating influences of the outside world. These medical justifications weren't just convenient excuses. They became deeply held beliefs that shaped how the aristocracy understood their own bodies and health. Courtiers who did fall ill were often convinced that their sickness resulted from insufficient commitment to the principles of noble uncleanliness, rather than from the obvious consequences of living in their own filth. This created a feedback loop where getting sick made people even more afraid to wash, as they interpreted their illness as punishment for whatever minimal hygiene they had maintained. The social dynamics of this unwashed court created bizarre hierarchies based on different types of filthiness. Courtiers began specializing in particular forms of uncleanliness, developing reputations for the distinctive qualities of their personal neglect. Some nobles became famous for their spectacularly dirty fingernails, growing them long and allowing them to accumulate impressive collections of grime that they would display like jewelry. Others cultivated signature body odors by avoiding certain foods, or consuming others specifically to enhance their natural aroma. The Duchess of Montpensier became legendary for her commitment to never washing her feet, claiming that the accumulated dirt on her soles connected her directly to the sacred soil of France. She would hold court while removing her shoes to display her blackened feet to admirers who praised the patriotic symbolism of her unwashed extremities. The Duke of Saint-Simon, meanwhile, gained notoriety for his practice of never changing his undergarments, wearing the same linens until they literally disintegrated on his body. He claimed this demonstrated his philosophical commitment to accepting the natural cycles of decay and renewal that governed all earthly things. The competition among courtiers to achieve new heights of aristocratic filthiness led to increasingly creative forms of deliberate uncleanliness. Some nobles began rubbing dirt into their skin to achieve a more authentic appearance of natural grime. Others would sleep in stables or roll in mud before important court appearances, claiming these practices connected them to the earthy authenticity that separated true nobility from pretentious social climbers. The irony was profound. People were working harder to appear dirty than most commoners worked to stay clean. The dining practices at Versailles reflected this same commitment to sanctified squalor. Courtiers would eat with unwashed hands, considering the accumulated grime on their fingers as seasoning that enhanced the flavor of their food. The elaborate table settings, never properly cleaned, became archaeological records of previous meals, with layers of food residue building up over months and years. The king himself took pride in eating with his bare hands, refusing utensils as tools of common people who lacked the refined palate necessary to appreciate food enhanced by noble finger grime. The wine goblets and plates used by the aristocracy were deliberately left unwashed between uses, creating unique patterns of accumulated filth that were considered marks of authenticity. Servants were instructed never to scrub these vessels too vigorously, as removing the layers of ancient food residue would strip away the historical significance that made each piece valuable. The most prized dining implements were those that showed clear evidence of decades of use without cleaning. Their surfaces built up with organic deposits that told the story of countless noble meals. Personal servants at Versailles found themselves trapped in an impossible situation, required to maintain their master's appearance while avoiding any practices that might accidentally make them clean. The art of aristocratic grooming became a delicate balance between making courtiers presentable enough for public appearances while ensuring they remained sufficiently dirty to demonstrate their noble authenticity. Valets developed specialized techniques for arranging unwashed hair into elaborate styles that concealed the worst of the accumulated grime while creating the illusion of careful attention to appearance. The powder that courtiers used to manage their body odor became an art form in itself, with different nobles developing signature scent combinations that masked their natural aromas without eliminating them entirely. These powders, often mixed with ground flowers, spices, and even precious metals, created complex olfactory experiences that were designed to intrigue rather than simply conceal. The goal wasn't to smell clean, it was to smell expensively dirty, to demonstrate that even one's personal neglect was a luxury that ordinary people couldn't afford. The laundresses who worked at Versailles developed their own peculiar expertise, learning to clean the outer garments worn by courtiers while leaving strategic areas unwashed to maintain the appropriate level of noble grime. They would scrub visible stains that might embarrass their employers in public, while carefully preserving the underlying layers of accumulated filth that demonstrated aristocratic authenticity. This selective cleaning required considerable skill and knowledge of court politics, as removing too much dirt from the wrong person could result in accusations of attempting to undermine their noble status. The elaborate court ceremonies that made Versailles famous became even more surreal when performed by participants who hadn't bathed in months. The formal dances that were central to court life took on an almost hallucinogenic quality, as dozens of unwashed bodies moved together in close proximity, creating clouds of competing aromas that mixed with the perfumes and powders into an atmospheric cocktail that visitors described as both intoxicating and nauseating. The contrast between the precision of the choreography and the chaotic assault on the senses created an otherworldly experience that seemed to exist outside normal human reality. The king's daily routines, observed by hundreds of courtiers as part of the elaborate ceremony of royal life, became public demonstrations of the principles of noble uncleanliness. Each morning, Louis would wake in bedsheets that hadn't been changed in weeks, their fabrics stiff with accumulated sweat and bodily oils. The ceremonial dressing process involved layers of unwashed undergarments being placed on his unwashed body, each piece adding another barrier between the king and any accidental contact with cleanliness. The courtiers who attended these rituals learned to breathe shallowly and position themselves strategically to minimize their exposure to the concentrated royal aroma while maintaining the appearance of eager participation in this daily worship of aristocratic filth. The morning lever ceremony, where the king would rise and dress before an audience of privileged nobles, became a masterclass in the performance of sanctified squalor. Picture the scene: dozens of France's most powerful aristocrats, many having travelled for days to witness this daily ritual, standing in formation around Louis's bedchamber as he emerged from sheets that had absorbed months of royal secretions. The bed itself had become a kind of shrine to accumulated filth, its silk coverings stained with patterns that told the story of the king's nocturnal emissions, sweat, and the occasional nosebleed that came from his rotting teeth. The courtiers, who were granted the honour of assisting with the king's toilette, had developed an elaborate choreography designed to maximise their exposure to his sacred uncleanliness. The Duke of Orléans, Louis's own brother, would compete with other high-ranking nobles for the privilege of handing the king his unwashed stockings, considering the brief contact with royal leg grime as a form of communion with divine authority. These stockings, worn for weeks at a time, had developed their own ecosystem of bacteria and fungi that created unique textures and aromas depending on the season and the king's recent activities. The process of dressing Louis became an exercise in layering filth upon filth, each garment adding its own contribution to the complex bouquet of royal decomposition. His undergarments, never laundered, were rotated in a system that allowed each piece to ripen for optimal aromatic impact before being worn again. The courtiers would comment knowledgeably on the subtle differences between Tuesday's shirt and Thursday's, discussing the way certain fabrics held the king's essence better than others, debating whether silk or linen provided superior preservation of noble perspiration. Louis's wigs, which had become necessary to conceal his increasingly matted and lice-infested natural hair, were themselves monuments to aristocratic neglect. The royal wig-maker, a man named Binet, who had elevated hairstyling into a form of performance art, would spend hours each morning arranging elaborate coiffures that incorporated not just the king's artificial hair, but also strategic displays of the organic matter that had accumulated within the powdered curls. Lice were not removed, but rather arranged artistically, their movements creating a subtle animation that courtiers praised as evidence of the wig's natural vitality. The king's face, painted each morning with cosmetics that were never fully removed from the previous day's application, had developed a topographical complexity that fascinated court observers. Layers of powder, rouge, and lead-based paint had built up over months, creating ridges and valleys that shifted with his facial expressions. When Louis smiled, which he did frequently during morning audiences, cracks would appear in the cosmetic surface, revealing glimpses of the unwashed skin beneath like geological strata, telling the story of aristocratic decay. But perhaps most disturbing was the way this systematic filthiness affected the king's relationship with food and eating. Louis had developed the habit of tasting his meals with unwashed fingers, claiming that the accumulated grime on his hands enhanced the flavor of even the finest delicacies. Court chefs learned to prepare dishes specifically designed to complement the king's finger dirt, creating sauces and seasonings that would interact pleasantly with whatever organic matter happened to be lodged beneath his fingernails on any given day. The royal dining experiences became theatrical performances, where the king would demonstrate various techniques for eating without utensils, explaining to fascinated courtiers how different types of food required different applications of aristocratic hand grime. Meat dishes, he claimed, benefited from the saltiness of unwashed palms, while sweet desserts were enhanced by the complex bacterial cultures that thrived in the creases of his knuckles. Watching the king eat became a form of education in the sophisticated relationship between noble uncleanliness and culinary appreciation. Louis's teeth, or what remained of them, had become another source of aristocratic pride rather than embarrassment, as his dental hygiene consisted entirely of occasional wine rinses and the removal of particularly troublesome food particles with unwashed fingernails. His mouth had developed into a showcase of noble decay. Courtiers would listen carefully to the whistling sounds that escaped through gaps in his rotting teeth, interpreting these audio effects as evidence of the unique musical qualities that distinguished royal speech from common conversation. The king's breath, legendary throughout Europe for its potency, became a diplomatic tool in itself. Foreign ambassadors would arrive at Versailles prepared for the olfactory assault of Louis's personal presence, but few were ready for the concentrated impact of his speaking directly to them during audiences. The royal breath carried notes of dental decay, unwashed mouth, and whatever exotic foods the king had recently consumed with his dirty hands, creating an aromatic experience so intense that many diplomats reported feeling lightheaded during their meetings with His Majesty. Court physicians had developed elaborate theories to explain why the king's deteriorating oral health was actually evidence of his superior royal constitution. Dr. Fagan, who succeeded Valor as royal physician, claimed that Louis's rotting teeth demonstrated how noble blood was so refined that it couldn't tolerate the common minerals found in regular food. The holes in the king's teeth were described as sacred cavities that allowed divine wisdom to flow directly into his brain, while the constant pain from dental infections was reframed as spiritual ecstasy that connected the monarch to the suffering of Christ. The social ripple effects of the king's dental decay spread throughout the court as nobles began deliberately neglecting their own oral hygiene to demonstrate solidarity with royal suffering. Courtiers would compete to achieve the most authentic-looking tooth rot, some even paying discreet dentists to artificially age their teeth with acids and abrasives. The sound of noble teeth grinding and clicking became a constant background noise at court gatherings, a percussion section accompanying the music of aristocratic conversation. Women at court faced particular challenges in maintaining their commitment to noble uncleanliness while preserving some semblance of feminine appeal. The elaborate hairstyles that defined court fashion became engineering marvels designed to conceal months of unwashed hair while creating the illusion of careful grooming. These towering constructions, built on frameworks of wire and padding, became habitats for entire colonies of insects that courtiers learned to ignore or even celebrate as signs of their coiffure's natural authenticity. The Duchess of Burgundy, one of the most fashionable women at court, pioneered techniques for incorporating live insects into her hairstyles as decorative elements. She would arrive at evening gatherings with elaborate arrangements that featured strategically placed beetles and moths, claiming these creatures were attracted to the natural oils in unwashed aristocratic hair and therefore served as living proof of noble authenticity. Other court ladies began competing to create the most impressive insect displays, leading to a bizarre fashion trend where the quality of one's head lice became a mark of social status. The process of getting dressed for court functions became increasingly complex as women learned to layer their clothing in ways that would trap and concentrate their body odors for maximum aristocratic impact. Undergarments were deliberately chosen for their ability to absorb and hold perspiration, with certain fabrics prized for the way they would ferment bodily secretions into distinctive aromatic signatures. The most fashionable ladies would change their outer garments regularly, while never washing the inner layers, creating a system where their public appearance remained elegant, while their personal uncleanliness reached impressive depths. The art of applying cosmetics over unwashed skin became a specialized skill that required considerable expertise. Court makeup artists learned to work around existing layers of grime and previous makeup applications, creating complex color palettes that incorporated the natural hues of accumulated dirt and skin oils. The most skilled practitioners could create the illusion of a fresh, clean face, while actually adding additional layers to months-old accumulations of cosmetic residue. Dancing, which remained central to court social life, took on surreal qualities when performed by participants who hadn't bathed in months. The elaborate ballroom ceremonies that made Versailles famous became olfactory adventures, where the movement of dozens of unwashed bodies created constantly shifting clouds of competing aromas. Partners would breathe shallowly during close contact, while the musicians learned to position themselves upwind of the dancers to avoid being overwhelmed by the concentrated aristocratic atmosphere. The king himself had become legendary for his dancing abilities, but his performances were now as much about managing his personal aroma as displaying his choreographic skills. Louis had developed signature moves that would strategically release concentrated bursts of royal scent at climactic moments, timing these olfactory flourishes to coincide with musical crescendos. Court observers learned to interpret these aromatic punctuation marks as evidence of the king's artistic sophistication, praising his ability to engage all the senses in his performances. The gambling that consumed much of court social life became complicated by the hygiene standards that now defined aristocratic authenticity. Card games required close contact between players who were all committed to avoiding cleanliness, creating intimate gatherings where the air would become thick with the concentrated essence of noble neglect. The cards themselves, never cleaned, became artifacts that absorbed the finger oils and skin flakes of successive players, developing unique textures and scents that regular gamblers learned to identify and appreciate. Louis had established specific etiquette rules governing how courtiers should manage their personal aromas during gaming sessions. Players were expected to position themselves to ensure their scent would reach their opponents without being overwhelming, creating a delicate balance between aristocratic authenticity and practical playability. The king would often circulate during these games, offering commentary not just on the cards being played, but on the aromatic contributions each participant was making to the overall atmosphere. The religious services that punctuated court life became exercises in collective endurance, as hundreds of unwashed aristocrats gathered in enclosed spaces for extended periods. The royal chapel at Versailles, despite its soaring architecture and elaborate ventilation systems, would fill with a fog of human emanations that priests learned to navigate while delivering their sermons. Father Massillon, the court preacher, developed a speaking style that allowed him to deliver spiritual guidance while breathing as little as possible, turning religious oratory into a form of athletic performance. The king's own religious devotions had become inseparable from his commitment to bodily uncleanliness. Louis would spend hours in prayer, claiming that his unwashed state brought him closer to the divine by rejecting worldly vanity and embracing spiritual mortification. His personal chapel sessions became legendary among courtiers, who would position themselves nearby to witness the king's aromatic prayers, interpreting the intensity of his body odor as evidence of the depth of his spiritual commitment. The contrast between the visual splendor of Versailles and the olfactory reality of its inhabitants created a sensory experience unlike anything else in European history. Visitors would arrive expecting to witness the pinnacle of human refinement, and instead find themselves in a palace where the most beautiful people in France smelled worse than common laborers. The cognitive dissonance between what they saw and what they smelled created a dreamlike atmosphere that many found both fascinating and deeply disturbing. Foreign diplomats struggled to maintain their composure during official ceremonies where they were required to stand in close proximity to the French court for extended periods. The Spanish ambassador reported that attending a single audience with Louis required days of recovery, while the English envoy claimed that his clothing retained the scent of Versailles for weeks after each visit, no matter how many times it was cleaned. These diplomatic challenges became part of France's international reputation, with other European courts preparing their representatives for the unique sensory assault they would face when dealing with the Sun King's government. The servants who worked most closely with the royal family found themselves in an impossible situation, required to maintain the appearance of caring for their masters while avoiding any actions that might accidentally make them cleaner. The king's valets developed specialized techniques for managing royal clothing that involved strategic cleaning of visible areas, while carefully preserving the underlying layers of accumulated grime that demonstrated noble authenticity. This selective hygiene required considerable skill and knowledge of court politics, as overcleaning the wrong garment could result in accusations of undermining aristocratic principles. The palace staff had created an entire underground economy around the management of noble filth, with different servants specializing in various aspects of aristocratic uncleanliness maintenance. Some focused on the careful preservation of unwashed undergarments, while others specialized in the strategic application of powders and perfumes that would mask the worst odors without eliminating the underlying authenticity that courtiers prized. The most skilled servants could assess a nobleman's current level of grime and recommend exactly how much additional neglect would be needed to achieve optimal aristocratic impact. The royal kitchens at Versailles had become theatres of culinary horror, where the finest chefs in Europe were forced to adapt their artistry to accommodate the court's commitment to sanctified squalor. The head chef, François Massielot, found himself in the unprecedented position of having to create elaborate banquets for diners who insisted on eating with unwashed hands and rotting teeth. His kitchen staff developed specialized techniques for preparing foods that would complement rather than clash with the various stages of aristocratic decay their patrons had achieved. The preparation of royal meals became an exercise in aromatic chemistry, as cooks learned to balance the natural flavors of their ingredients with the anticipated contributions from dirty fingers and infected mouths. Sauces were specifically formulated to mask the taste of whatever organic matter might transfer from unwashed hands to food, while desserts were designed to provide enough sweetness to overwhelm the bitter notes that emerge from rotting dental work. The royal sommelier faced similar challenges, selecting wines that would harmonize with the complex bacterial cultures that thrived in the king's mouth. Louis himself had developed highly specific preferences about how his food should interact with his personal uncleanliness. He claimed that certain dishes tasted better when consumed after he had spent time handling his unwashed clothing or scratching his unclean scalp. The king would often delay meals until he had achieved what he considered the optimal level of hand contamination, explaining to fascinated courtiers how different activities contributed unique flavor notes to his dining experience. The royal dining room became a laboratory for aristocratic gastronomy, where the relationship between food and filth was elevated to an art form. Courtiers would arrive at banquets having deliberately avoided washing their hands for days, competing to achieve the most sophisticated finger grime that would enhance their culinary experience. The king would inspect his guests' hands before meals, praising those who had achieved particularly impressive accumulations of dirt and criticizing anyone whose fingers appeared suspiciously clean. The elaborate table settings that adorned royal banquets told their own story of calculated neglect. The finest porcelain and silver in Europe was deliberately left uncleaned between uses, with servants instructed to preserve the patina of previous meals as evidence of the service's aristocratic pedigree. Plates would accumulate layers of food residue that created unique textures and flavors, while wine goblets developed complex ecosystems of bacteria that courtiers claimed enhanced the taste of even the finest vintages. The king's personal eating habits had become legendary throughout Europe for their commitment to noble uncleanliness. Louis would demonstrate various techniques for incorporating dirt into his dining experience, showing courtiers how to season their food with strategic applications of unwashed finger grime. He had developed preferences for different types of hand contamination, claiming that dirt from his morning grooming sessions provided different flavor profiles than grime accumulated during afternoon activities. The royal physicians had created elaborate medical justifications for these dining practices, claiming that the bacteria in unwashed hands aided digestion and that sterile food was actually harmful to aristocratic constitutions. Dr. Fagon published treatises explaining how noble blood required the constant introduction of organic matter through contaminated food to maintain its refined character. According to his theories, courtiers who ate with clean hands would gradually lose their aristocratic essence and descend to the level of common people. The social dynamics of these contaminated banquets created bizarre hierarchies based on different types of hand filth. Courtiers specialized in particular forms of finger contamination, developing reputations for the unique qualities their personal grime brought to shared meals. The Marquis de Maintenon became famous for his practice of rubbing his hands in stable dirt before dining, claiming this connected him to the earthy authenticity of French soil. The Duchess of Nemours, meanwhile, gained notoriety for never cleaning beneath her fingernails, allowing them to accumulate impressive deposits that she would strategically deploy during meals. The children born at Versailles grew up in this atmosphere of sanctified squalor, learning from infancy that cleanliness was a mark of social inferiority and spiritual weakness. The royal nurseries became training grounds for aristocratic uncleanliness, where young nobles learned the complex social codes that governed acceptable levels of personal neglect. Tutors would instruct their charges in the proper techniques for avoiding baths while maintaining the appearance of careful grooming, teaching them to see dirt as a badge of honor rather than a source of shame. The Dauphin, Louis's own son and heir to the throne, became a particularly tragic example of how this system corrupted even the youngest members of the royal family. From the moment he could walk, the future king was taught that washing his body was a form of spiritual rebellion that would displease God and dishonor his royal bloodline. His nursemaids were instructed to prevent him from coming into contact with water except for the minimal face wiping that royal protocol required, and any attempts he made to clean himself were treated as evidence of dangerous common tendencies that needed to be corrected. By the age of 10, the Dauphin had developed skin conditions that palace physicians praised as signs of his noble constitution's superiority over common children who suffered from the spiritual weakness of cleanliness. His chronic rashes and infections were described as evidence that royal blood was too refined to tolerate the harsh realities of daily hygiene, and his obvious discomfort was reframed as aristocratic sensitivity that proved his fitness for eventual rule. The young prince's education included detailed instruction in the religious and philosophical principles that justified aristocratic filthiness. His tutors, carefully selected for their commitment to the court's hygiene philosophy, taught him that his unwashed state was a form of religious devotion that connected him directly to divine authority. The Dauphin learned to recite elaborate theological arguments explaining why soap was a tool of the devil and why true nobility expressed itself through calculated neglect of bodily cleanliness. The marriage negotiations that would eventually determine the Dauphin's bride became complicated by his reputation for spectacular personal uncleanliness. Foreign courts that might have welcomed an alliance with France began expressing concerns about subjecting their daughters to the hygiene standards that had become synonymous with Versailles. The Spanish court, despite its own relaxed attitudes toward bathing, privately questioned whether their princess could survive marriage to a prince whose commitment to filthiness had become legendary across Europe. The papal nuncio, who served as the Vatican's representative at Versailles, found himself in the awkward position of trying to provide spiritual guidance to a court whose religious practices included the deliberate cultivation of bodily corruption. While the Catholic Church had historically embraced certain forms of physical mortification, the systematic filthiness practiced at Versailles went far beyond traditional ascetic practices and entered territory that even medieval monks would have found excessive. His reports back to Rome, preserved in Vatican archives, reveal the diplomatic delicacy required to address the theological implications of the French court's hygiene practices, without directly criticizing the king, whose political support was crucial to Catholic interests throughout Europe. The nuncio developed elaborate theological arguments that attempted to distinguish between spiritually beneficial forms of bodily neglect and the potentially problematic extremes that had become fashionable at Versailles. The international reputation of the French court began affecting diplomatic relationships, as other European powers struggled to maintain normal diplomatic protocols with representatives who adhered to Versailles hygiene standards. The imperial court in Vienna established special procedures for receiving French ambassadors, including the provision of heavily perfumed reception rooms and the strategic positioning of diplomatic personnel to minimize their exposure to the aromatic challenges posed by their French counterparts. The English court, with its different cultural attitudes toward cleanliness, found French diplomatic visits particularly challenging. Queen Anne's household staff developed elaborate preparations for French delegations that included the strategic placement of potpourri and the discreet provision of breathing salts for English courtiers who might be overwhelmed by their guests' commitment to aristocratic authenticity. These diplomatic accommodations became part of the complex dance of international relations, with each court learning to navigate the unique sensory challenges posed by French representatives. The Russian court of Peter the Great, despite its own reputation for rough living, expressed amazement at the hygiene standards that French diplomats brought to their meetings. Russian observers noted that even their own notoriously unwashed boyars seemed fastidiously clean compared to representatives from Versailles, creating cultural misunderstandings that complicated attempts at diplomatic cooperation between the two powers. The economic implications of the court's commitment to filthiness began affecting French commerce as the reputation of Versailles spread throughout Europe. Foreign merchants who had previously competed for the privilege of supplying the French court began expressing reluctance to engage in close business relationships with customers whose personal habits had become legendary for their extremity. The luxury goods trade that had traditionally flowed toward Versailles began redirecting toward cleaner courts, creating economic pressures that the king's advisors struggled to address without directly challenging the hygiene philosophy that had become central to court identity. The perfume industry, paradoxically, experienced unprecedented growth as demand exploded for products that could mask rather than eliminate the aromas generated by aristocratic uncleanliness. French perfumers developed increasingly sophisticated formulations designed not to create cleanliness, but to transform noble filth into more socially acceptable forms of olfactory expression. These perfumes were engineered to work with rather than against the natural emanations of unwashed bodies, creating complex aromatic experiences that celebrated, rather than concealed, aristocratic authenticity. The textile industry faced similar challenges as clothing manufacturers learned to produce fabrics that would complement rather than conflict with the hygiene standards practiced at court. Silk weavers developed materials specifically designed to absorb and hold body oils without showing obvious stains, while tailors created garment designs that would trap and concentrate personal aromas for maximum aristocratic impact. The fashion industry that had traditionally served Versailles began specializing in clothing that would enhance rather than mask the effects of deliberate uncleanliness. The royal gardens at Versailles became testing grounds for horticultural experiments designed to create outdoor spaces that would complement the aromatic atmosphere generated by the court's inhabitants. Landscape designers planted specific flowers and herbs that would harmonize with, rather than overwhelm the scents produced by hundreds of unwashed aristocrats gathering for outdoor entertainments. Garden parties became complex exercises in environmental engineering where natural fragrances were carefully balanced against human emanations to create tolerable outdoor experiences. The king's own relationship with the natural world had been transformed by his commitment to bodily uncleanliness. Louis claimed that his unwashed state allowed him to communicate more directly with the earth and its creatures, arguing that cleanliness created an artificial barrier between humans and the natural environment. He would spend hours in his gardens without bathing afterward, claiming that the combination of soil, plant matter, and royal perspiration created a unique connection to the divine forces that governed both nature and monarchy. The elaborate water features that adorned Versailles became symbols of the court's rejection of cleanliness rather than celebrations of its purifying properties. The fountains and pools that had originally been designed to showcase the power and sophistication of French engineering were reinterpreted as artistic statements about the superiority of noble filth over common cleanliness. Courtiers would gather around these water displays to admire their beauty, while pointedly avoiding any contact with the cleansing element they contained. The irony was profound and disturbing. Here was the most magnificent palace in Europe, surrounded by the most advanced hydraulic engineering of its age, inhabited by people who had convinced themselves that the fundamental purpose of all that water was purely decorative. The technological marvels that supplied Versailles with abundant clean water served only to highlight the deliberate perversity of a court that had access to unlimited cleanliness but chose systematic filth as a mark of spiritual and social superiority. The servants who maintained these water systems found themselves in the bizarre position of ensuring perfect hydraulic function for features that their masters would never use for their intended purpose. The elaborate pumping systems, aqueducts, and reservoirs that supplied the palace continued to operate at peak efficiency, providing crystal-clear water that flowed unused past aristocrats who wore their accumulated grime like jewelry and breathed their own corruption like incense. The maintenance crews who worked on the fountains and pools reported that the water remained pristine, while the people who admired it grew increasingly rancid, creating a surreal contrast between the purity of the engineering and the deliberate corruption of its intended beneficiaries. These workers, drawn from the common classes that had never abandoned basic hygiene, found themselves serving a nobility that had elevated their own filthiness into a form of artistic expression while maintaining mechanical perfection in the very systems they refused to use. The symbolic weight of this contradiction wasn't lost on foreign observers who saw in it a perfect metaphor for the broader dysfunction that was beginning to characterize French society under Louis's absolute rule. Here was a monarchy that could marshal the resources and expertise to create engineering marvels, but couldn't recognize the basic human need for cleanliness. A court that celebrated its own decay while maintaining the infrastructure that could have prevented it. A ruling class that had confused self-destruction with sophistication and mistaken deliberate ignorance for divine wisdom. The water that flowed so beautifully through the gardens of Versailles would continue to flow long after the unwashed courtiers who refused to use it had crumbled into the dust they had so lovingly cultivated on their living bodies, leaving behind only the memory of how completely a civilization could lose its way when power became disconnected from wisdom and authority, divorced itself from the basic requirements of human dignity. And so, the grand experiment in aristocratic filth that had consumed the French court for decades finally began to collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. By the 1680s, even the most devoted followers of Louis's hygiene philosophy were struggling to maintain their commitment to sanctified squalor as the physical and social consequences became impossible to ignore. The death toll from preventable diseases had reached levels that shocked even court physicians who had spent years justifying the medical benefits of unwashed living. Skin infections that began as minor irritations had progressed to life-threatening conditions that no amount of theological rationalization could cure. The elaborate powders and perfumes that had once masked the worst effects of deliberate uncleanliness were now powerless against the advanced stages of decay that many courtiers had achieved. The Marquise de Montespan, once celebrated for her spectacular commitment to avoiding water, became one of the first high-ranking nobles to quietly abandon the court's hygiene principles after developing infections so severe that they threatened her life. Her discreet return to bathing created a scandal that rippled through Versailles, with some courtiers accusing her of spiritual weakness, while others began secretly questioning their own dedication to noble filthiness. The king himself, now in his 40s, was beginning to show the cumulative effects of decades spent cultivating his own corruption. His skin had developed a greyish pallor that no amount of cosmetic artistry could conceal, while his breath had become so toxic that even his most devoted courtiers found excuses to avoid close conversation. The royal physicians, faced with mounting evidence that their patient was literally rotting alive, began quietly suggesting modifications to his hygiene routine, under the guise of new theological discoveries about the relationship between cleanliness and divine favour. Dr. Fagan, the king's personal physician, found himself in an impossible position as Louis's health deteriorated in ways that could no longer be explained away as signs of aristocratic superiority. The infected sores that covered the royal body had begun to resist even the most exotic treatments, while the king's digestive system, compromised by years of eating with contaminated hands, struggled to process even the simplest foods. Fagan began introducing what he called medicinal washing, strategic cleaning of specific body parts that he claimed would enhance, rather than compromise, the king's spiritual authenticity. The younger generation of courtiers, many of whom had grown up in the atmosphere of sanctified squalor, but were now reaching ages where they sought marriages and alliances with cleaner European courts, began quietly rebelling against the hygiene standards that had defined their childhoods. The Duc de Chartres, Louis's nephew, became one of the first young nobles to openly question whether decades of accumulated wisdom about the spiritual benefits of filthiness might need reconsideration in light of mounting evidence about its physical costs. These generational tensions created subtle fractures in the unified front that had once characterized the court's commitment to aristocratic uncleanliness. Older courtiers who had invested decades in perfecting their personal decay found themselves defending practices that younger nobles increasingly viewed as outdated and potentially dangerous. The elaborate social hierarchies based on different types of filthiness began to seem less sophisticated and more simply disgusting to aristocrats who had witnessed the deaths of friends and family members from entirely preventable hygiene-related diseases. The international isolation that France had experienced as other European courts distanced themselves from Versailles began to have serious diplomatic and economic consequences that even Louis could no longer ignore. Trade relationships that had once been automatic were now complicated by foreign reluctance to engage closely with French representatives whose personal habits had become legendary throughout Europe. Marriage negotiations that should have strengthened French alliances instead founded on the practical question of whether foreign princesses could survive the hygiene standards expected at Versailles. The papal nuncio's reports to Rome had grown increasingly concerned about the theological implications of practices that seemed to have moved beyond traditional concepts of mortification into territory that bordered on deliberate self-harm. Vatican theologians, who had initially supported the French court's emphasis on spiritual over physical concerns, began quietly expressing doubts about whether the extremes practiced at Versailles were consistent with Christian teachings about the body as a temple of the Holy Spirit. The economic costs of maintaining the elaborate systems needed to support a court of deliberately unwashed aristocrats had begun to strain even the vast resources of the French monarchy. The specialized perfumes, powders, and clothing required to make hundreds of filthy nobles presentable for public functions consume budgets that might have been used for more practical governmental purposes. The constant replacement of furnishings, carpets, and decorations that had been ruined by prolonged exposure to unwashed inhabitants created ongoing expenses that royal accountants struggled to justify. The servant population at Versailles, caught between their natural human revulsion at the conditions they were required to maintain and their economic dependence on royal employment, began showing signs of collective psychological strain. Many developed what palace administrators euphemistically called nervous conditions, symptoms that modern observers would recognize as trauma responses to prolonged exposure to deliberately created squalor. The turnover rate among palace staff reached levels that threatened the basic functioning of royal household operations. Even the king's most devoted supporters began to recognize that the system they had helped create was consuming itself. The Duke of Saint-Simon, who had once competed enthusiastically in contests of aristocratic filthiness, wrote privately about his growing concerns that the court's hygiene philosophy had led them into territory that no reasonable person could defend. His secret memoirs, discovered centuries later, reveal a man struggling to reconcile his loyalty to Louis with his recognition that they had all participated in something that had grown beyond eccentricity into genuine madness. The beginning of the end came when Louis himself, faced with a particularly severe infection that threatened his life, quietly submitted to what Dr. Fagan called emergency spiritual cleansing, essentially a full bath administered under the pretense of medical necessity. The king's recovery was so dramatic and immediate that even he could no longer deny the connection between his improved health and his temporary abandonment of the hygiene principles he had spent decades promoting. Word of the king's secret bath spread through the court like wildfire, creating a crisis of faith among courtiers who had sacrificed their health and comfort in service of principles that their monarch had apparently abandoned the moment his own life was at stake. The elaborate philosophical and theological justifications that had supported decades of deliberate uncleanliness suddenly seemed hollow when confronted with the undeniable evidence that cleanliness had saved the king's life while filthiness had nearly killed him. The collapse of the court's commitment to sanctified squalor happened with surprising speed once it began. Courtiers who had spent years perfecting their personal decay suddenly discovered urgent reasons to adopt what they carefully termed modified hygiene practices for enhanced spiritual development. The same nobles who had once competed to achieve the most impressive accumulations of grime now competed to achieve the most elegant transitions back to basic cleanliness while preserving their dignity and social standing. The bathing facilities at Versailles, unused for decades except by servants and the occasional rebellious young noble, suddenly found themselves overwhelmed by demand from aristocrats seeking to discreetly wash away the evidence of their participation in the great experiment in royal filthiness. The palace's elaborate water systems, maintained in perfect condition despite years of aristocratic neglect, finally fulfilled their intended purpose as hundreds of unwashed courtiers rediscovered the simple pleasure of being clean. Louis himself, his authority undermined by his obvious hypocrisy in abandoning the principles he had forced others to follow, found his absolute power subtly but permanently weakened. Courtiers who had once hung on his every word about the spiritual benefits of uncleanliness now questioned other royal pronouncements with a skepticism that would have been unthinkable during the height of the filthiness cult. The king's credibility, built on decades of successful manipulation and control, had been damaged by his practical admission that the hygiene philosophy he had imposed on his court was ultimately unsustainable. The return to basic human cleanliness at Versailles happened gradually, with courtiers carefully navigating the social and political implications of abandoning practices that had defined their identities for decades. The elaborate rituals and ceremonies that had celebrated aristocratic uncleanliness were quietly modified or abandoned, replaced by more conventional expressions of royal grandeur that didn't require participants to sacrifice their health and dignity in service of bizarre philosophical principles. The servants who had endured years of managing deliberately filthy aristocrats experienced their own complex reactions to the court's return to sanity. Many felt vindicated in their private doubts about the wisdom of the hygiene philosophy they had been forced to support, while others struggled with the psychological adjustment required to serve masters who had suddenly rediscovered basic human decency after years of calculated degradation. The palace itself required extensive renovation to repair the damage caused by decades of occupation by hundreds of unwashed inhabitants. Carpets that had absorbed years of aristocratic emanations had to be completely replaced, while walls and furnishings required specialized cleaning techniques to remove the accumulated residue of the great experiment in sanctified squalor. The restoration work became a physical metaphor for the court's broader attempt to cleanse itself of the corruption that had defined it for so long. In the end, the story of Louis XIV's court and its bizarre relationship with cleanliness serves as a powerful reminder of how completely human societies can lose their way when authority becomes divorced from wisdom and power separated from responsibility. The Sun King's ability to convince hundreds of intelligent, educated people to abandon basic hygiene in service of his twisted philosophy demonstrates the dangerous malleability of human nature when confronted with absolute authority backed by elaborate justification. The courtiers who participated in this grand delusion weren't evil people. They were individuals trapped in a system that rewarded conformity and punished independent thinking, who gradually normalized increasingly extreme behaviors until they found themselves living in conditions that would have horrified their younger selves. Their story reminds us that civilization itself is more fragile than we like to believe, and that the distance between sophistication and savagery can be crossed with surprising ease when those in power lose sight of basic human values. The water that had flowed unused through the fountains of Versailles during those dark decades stands as a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the depths of collective madness, the infrastructure of sanity and dignity can be preserved, waiting for the moment when reason reasserts itself and humanity rediscovers the simple wisdom of staying clean, staying healthy, and treating our bodies with the respect they deserve. The legacy of Louis XIV's court reminds us that true nobility lies not in the elaborate performance of artificial superiority, but in the quiet dignity of treating ourselves and others with basic human respect. A lesson as relevant today as it was in the perfumed halls of history's most magnificently dirty palace.